What is going on, all of you sexy people? It's Rexy here. Now, first off, before we get started, there's gonna be no music in this compared to my other videos, just because there's a lot of things I have to go over, and it's gonna take a lot of time and patience, and it's gonna be a little more difficult to concentrate because the things I'm gonna be talking about are pretty in depth and stuff like that. So I thought music would be, kind of out of the question. So I apologize for those of you who wanted to listen to some cool non-copyright music in the background. But anyways, now today I'm gonna be bringing you guys my brand new series, which is called Master Mechanics. For those of you who aren't actually familiar with who I am, or you're new to my channel, I'm a Grandmaster's Duelist, and I'm known pretty well for my knowledge of mechanics. I noticed there aren't hardly any in-depth guides that really explain actual mechanical things in Smite, such as things like auto-attack progression, auto-attack canceling, juking patterns, things like that, right? So I thought I'd be the one to teach you guys. There are so many things that we have to go over in the series, so to begin it all, I thought I'd start with one of the most important things, which is counter-building. Now I understand some of you might be mainly Conquest players, but this episode can still actually help you. I'm going to be going over specific item counters, matchup, builds, and general knowledge of counter building on a single enemy, which can also be quite useful to even know in Conquest. Now, I'm aware that builds aren't really all that much to do with mechanics, but it's an extremely important factor in the general game of Smite. So I thought, before I got too in-depth of the concept of mechanics, I'd get the hardest thing out of the way, which is counter building, and, the challenge of it. So without further ado, let's get started. One last and important note before we hit our categories is, remember, I am only human, just like all of you. I'm not some deity of counterbuilding, and neither are pro players. This is all based on my opinion and my experience. There's always going to be a different and better build depending on the meta and the scenario. Although I will say I have thousands of games worth of experience on a high level over the past few years of my career in maining one-on-one, and I've learned a lot on counterbuilding your opponents, and I've also had lots of help from some of the top ranked people in Duel who've assisted me and gave their insight into this. So even though this might be coming from some of the best Duel players, remember this is all opinion based. If you think there's a better build, go for it. If you think I'm wrong in certain things, I'm all ears. Leave me a comment on this video explaining why. We all play this game for fun, so there's no reason to force things onto others. We all want to learn how to get better at the game we love, which is why I take absolutely no offense to you guys proving me wrong. I want you to prove me wrong. All out of the way, let's get counter building. So, this episode is going to be divided into about 4 categories, the most important pieces I've found to counterbuilding: the matchup, their items, thinking ahead, and counterbuilding itself. Let's get started with your matchup. Number 1, your matchup. Your matchup has quite a few factors to it, and what I mean by your matchup is both your forms of damages and your kits. Your god. The god you and your opponent are playing obviously have the biggest impact on how you should be building. The god you chose has a certain form of damage and a unique kit. Building magical defense versus a physical doesn't work all that well, trust me. Here are the general counters I found based on experience. There are 3 main ways a god deals damage to you. I'll go over the counters of these forms of damage out of personal experience. Magical ability-based damage. Gods such as Hebo, Kukulkan, Raijin, etc. Physical ability-based damage, such as Loki, Susanoo, Thanatos, etc. Physical auto-attack based damage, ADCs, most assassins, etc. And finally, magical auto-attack based damage, which there are only 2 gods of, which consist of Freya and Kronos. Magical ability-based damage is usually centered on high burst damage that kills you very quickly. For all bursts in general, a good counter is building into higher HP. The higher the HP, the harder it becomes for your opponent to just simply one-shot you with the ability damage. Remember, abilities only do X amount of damage. Mages like Kukulkan, Poseidon, and Hebo all have insanely high burst damage, and without a decent amount of HP and any defense, that shit can literally one-shot you. That's why mages practically ruled the duel meta in Season 2. With such a small map, the ability to freely farm, and 6 camps, no pull demon, playing passive until they came online just made them so dominant. Physical ability-based damage is a bit of a different story. It's still quite similar to magical ability-based damage, but physical ability-based damage is the only way some physical gods can even be playable in Duel. There's actually an extremely low of ability-based physical gods that are even playable in the current Duel meta. The reason for this is auto-attack based gods are just so insanely strong on this map. For example, most hunters, auto-attack based warriors, auto-attack based mages, and most auto-attack based assassins are just completely controlling the meta right now. Just take a look at Enshot's current tier list, which you can also use in future reference if you want to know who you want to main or learn how to build or counter-build against. These gods either have incredible sustain or just straight auto-attack based damage. Most of the ability based characters in a majority of roles such as mages, warriors, assassins, and guardians usually just can't get close enough or simply can't do enough damage to be effective early game, where they're supposed to, shine, which is why hunters that can continuously poke you and sustain from a distance do so well. I thought I'd quickly explain that because chances are you usually won't be running into very many physical ability-based gods in Duel. But a few exceptions are gods like maybe Susanoo and Loki. Their mobility and burst make them somewhat playable. But if you think about it, gods like Loki are usually forced to go all out if they want to kill you, so once again, the biggest counter to high burst of a Loki ult, for example, will be simply having a lot of health, as well as obviously defense. But you should always be buying defense in Duel. Ability-based gods only do set amount of damage, like I said. They don't have kins doing percentage based on health or crits, or even not usually that much health, as they mostly have to invest a lot of their gold into heavy power items to even kill you. The second biggest counter I've found to physical ability-based gods is high sustain. Physical ability-based gods are usually forced to get close to you to do their damage, or just poke you in lane. If they do attack you, they have to use their abilities and burst you, then disengage. You can simply continuously sustain after the engagements in waves, early, or just simply off them, as their HP will just remain the same. The reason why sustain is actually more effective against physical ability-based, more than magical ability-based, is because almost all magical gods are ranged, which means they can usually use their abilities from far away and easily poke you out and be forced not to take unnecessary damage, which makes lifesteal just a little bit less effective versus them. But don't get me wrong, depending on your god, lifesteal is almost necessary to pick up. You should almost always be in lifesteal on certain gods like hunters. And last but not least, we have the Rape Tree in itself, auto attack based damage. Now this is a tricky one because there's no real set in stone type of item like health or sustain that you can get that generically counters auto attack based gods at the moment. Reason for this, and the reason why they're so strong, is because their options and items destroy almost all their types of damage other than, non-auto attack based gods. Like Kin, for example, was buffed at the start of the season, meaning all health gets cut through like butter, making the health tree completely useless and ineffective. Executioner got buffed, letting them have even more pen, making it easier to cut through protections. Not too long ago, this was way worse though. Hunters were practically unbeatable. They had the option to get Golden Bow, an overpowered Soul Eater. These, along with the previous items I mentioned, made them very dominant. They could have ridiculous clear, tons of lifesteal with the heal that healed almost as much as a med, and all the crazy additional movement speed that made every other god obsolete. Those were very dark days indeed. So you can basically see why most auto attack based gods have been doing so well this season. The two items that help tremendously are obviously Hide the Nemean Lion as well as Witchblade. Depending on your god, it's usually better to get Nemean though. But getting both is also nice if you're something like a warrior. It's really good to buy in most matchups, as it's more protections than a breastplate and reflects 20% of the auto attack based damage, making crits practically impossible to use. It's one of the best items you can get if you're a tad behind or plan on playing passive, because if they're planning on building a certain way, it could give you the upper hand. Sometimes gods like ADCs are a tad squishy, so building high burst at times can also catch a squishy off guard and potentially one-shot them. But like I said, that's normally not as viable. Just remember that utility is also a huge factor, something that I also have trouble with even sometimes. It's not always about damage and numbers. As a physical ability based god, for example, full power would seem very good, but full CDR could prove to be 100 times more effective depending on your situation. I know going in depth about the current meta isn't all that focused on counterbuilding, but I thought I'd go over it regardless at the beginning so you get a good feel for what you're going to be going up against and how things are normally focused and built around in this meta. Also, the information I've given isn't very specific, just because it's just the general type of things you'll be able to build that do well against certain forms of damage. To put it simply, the most effective things to build based on their form of damage is the following. Magical ability-based damage is countered by high HP. Physical ability-based damage is countered by sustain, also high HP. Physical auto-attack based damage is countered by Nemean and Witchblade, and sometimes high burst. Magical auto-attack based is pretty much the same thing as magical ability based, but just simply pray you don't get late game. Abilities. The second most important thing to think about in your matchup is also your opponent's abilities. I just went over the counters to the normal damaging abilities and types of damage you can generally counter by numbers, but you also have to keep in mind the enemy's crowd control as well as parts of their kit that can also affect how you're building. For example, a god like Kukulkan has a slow, which is how he secures most of his burst damage. Late game, sometimes picking up something like a wing blade can be extremely useful. Or say you're up against an Anubis late game, having beads isn't always an option, so sometimes Magis is worth it. I'm going to go over this a lot more in the counter building category, but for now, let's think about this. Let's say I'm Bellona and you're MC, for example. My abilities destroy you for a number of reasons. If I build normally, I will shut you down early game to mid. And that's the case for most gods, which is why Bellona can be so unpredictable. Getting late can be very difficult with all the pressure she has. So let's say I go Death's Toll, Itchival, Boots, and Witchblade. The build at this point in the game will cost me 5,900 gold. Now the AMC has to go with the meta. And let's say he goes Bluestone, Ichival, Boots, and Devgons, costing the exact same amount. Do you see the problem yet? Bellona's kit consists of a slow with auto attack absorption, an AoE attack, a disarm that heals, and a stun. Currently, I am reducing upwards to 60 power from the AMC. The AMC has to build around the following: my healing, my protections, Witchblade plus the protections of a warrior, high attack speed with absorption, and he needs defense from my Ichival. So that's how many things the AMC has to build around. Bellona is always one step ahead in the scenario she builds correctly, which I'll discuss more in the thinking ahead category. The AMC is forced to go in defense, in which by the time you finish it, Bellona will have finished Executioner, still one step ahead. She could go Frostbound next if she wanted, or she could go more defense for example. She can always be one step ahead, force at objectives early, and pressure you to hell, which is why she's caught so many people off guard at the beginning of the season. Basically, abilities have a huge factor in what you need to build, and in what order, which is why you always have to keep a firm image in your mind of what your opponent's abilities do. That's why newer players in Duel kind of struggle, as they don't completely understand what their enemy's abilities do to the full extent, and can't really build accordingly. Next we have the second category, which is their items. This part is probably going to be the most extensive category in this episode, simply because I have a lot to go over in terms of specific item counters, and I can't really go over every single matchup and build counters in the entire game, obviously, as this episode would be 300 years long, and it's already long enough. So I'll be going over a bunch of generic counter builds and items and matchups for the final part, but for now we're just going to go over specific item counters. To begin with, let's start with the typical items in the meta people probably might buy. First off, we have Executioner and Titans, more or less percentage-based pen. This one is up for a bit of discussion on the terms of what technically counters it. I mean, obviously, no protections does well early game versus percentage pen, but late game you obviously need it. In rare cases, when your opponent buys percentage pen very early on, unless you're a Guardian, chances are your base protections will be quite low, making it very inefficient. You could skip going protections for a few items until around mid-game, where your base protections start to scale upward and start to become a problem for that percentage pen. Now the second counter, in my opinion, with a long discussion of others, is that double defense is a counter to Executioner in a lot of scenarios. If you think about it, with double defense the engagements are going to be drawn out, long and tedious, full of poking and just lots of dumb shit. So think about this: say I'm Fenrir or Hebo and I'm up against someone like on her AMC and I have double defense and he has Executioner. As Fenrir or Hebo, I'm going to use my abilities off cooldown to just poke him and then disengage. Every time I disengage and get away from him for a certain amount of time, his Executioner is going to keep resetting, making him only do 12% on the first hit, and he has to hit 3 autos before he gets up to 36%. In some cases where you can stick to the enemy with double defense, such as having a Fatalis or say a built-in Fatalis, make it worthwhile to buy though. Also keep in mind that gods like Erlang Shen, Bakasura, and some other gods rely so heavily on attack speed to keep up their damage and not so much on poke. So in these scenarios where you rely so heavily on your auto attack speed, Executioner is actually better. Kins. Now this is a fun one. A lot of people think if I go Thoth, I'll get tons of power and less HP, so Kins is technically less effective, right? Wrong. In about 95% of matchups, this is just... no, it doesn't work. Just think about this. There are only so many items in this game. As an ADC, usually even if they haven't built HP based, there really aren't that many items that would really be worth it as much in a scenario as getting a Kins. So either way, they usually just end up getting a Kins. But let's say you have Thoth, for example. Instead of having the 2,500 HP with Warlocks, instead you'll have around, let's say, 1,300. Just a random example. But think about this. With Kins, you're going to be getting only an extra 65 physical damage against that 1,300 health, compared to the 125 extra from when they have 2,500. 2,500. Can you spot the problem here yet? The problem is, although you're only getting hit for half as much as you will with Warlocks, which seems good, it's still only an extra 60. But they have almost double the amount of HP to go through. You'll be taking up quite a bit less damage from Kins, yes, but imagine if they built the trends. They'd literally be chunking your HP so quickly that even if they got remotely ahead and you had no protections, oh my god, they would like two-shot you. So keep in mind that protections also factor in. You could have defense with your Warlocks, making them do less damage, and you have a ton HP, compared to them doing, slightly less damage, yet you having half that HP. So in general, not building HP is not a counter to Kins, so don't think that. Low to no power items such as Ichival and Soul Eater. I put these two items together because they usually go together pretty well. Ignoring the Soul Eater's lifesteal that can obviously be countered by anti-lifesteal like Beatstick or Pestilence, There's two things in common about these items. Normally, they're the first three items a person buys. So the biggest counter you can have to these when together is power reduction. Matching interval is usually a good idea, but get a Witchblade early on. Solar and interval give no power, so having a Witchblade with that low amount of power reduces it even more. And if you have a Witchblade so early on, as well as like matching their interval, like their power is reduced so significantly, and you also get a ton of protections. This works very well on warriors, but remember, Nemean is still all around a better item, especially if it's late game, so always switch it out late game. Defense. Now, I'm not going to go over every single item in the shop because a lot of them are very similar in terms of what they do, such as defense, power, sustain, cooldowns, etc. So for defense, all you really have to think about are these two factors. Number one, how much defense they've got. Keep in mind that base protections also come into play with these items. So if they have very low protection items such as a Midgard, say it adds up to 60 total protections. Low protections are countered by high flat pen and flat protection reduction. So buying a beat stick and a void shield, for example, is a hell of a lot more effective than a Titan's, which only cuts through 33% and only gives you 20 pen. The second thing you need to keep in mind is the effect of what that item does. A few good examples, or obvious examples, are Pestilence. It counters healing, so not having healing is, usually a pretty good counter. But against something like Nemean, getting lifesteal versus Nemean is actually usually really good because your sustain can usually equal out for sometimes how much the Nemean itself reflects. But it also reflects auto attack damage, keep in mind, so not building auto attack based, if you can't help it, can also help as well. But usually it's not worth it. Passives on items such as Bulwark can be countered by having a Kins or a Soul Reaver, which chunks through percentage of HP. Cooldowns, like I said earlier, in the first category are countered normally, like I said, ability based with cooldowns. Sustain would probably be the most effective. These are pretty simple generic defense items, so I'm pretty sure you can figure out what does best against what for simple things like defense. Slowing items such as Frostbound. This is an item that doesn't give all that much power, but it also gives HP, making Kins a little more useful. But usually I found that ability based gods fare quite well versus this if they can keep their distance. But things like Wingblade can help if it's that big of a problem, and Sprint is always a good option. Fatalis. Fatalis is commonly picked up as the last item for most ADCs as it's great for kiting. Fatalis really kills most close range gods, so Sprint is obviously a good choice. But the best counter you can have to a person that built Fatalis is to pretty much just match their Fatalis. The legendary Frostbound Fatalis combo, as well as Gem of Iso plus Fatalis. Believe it or not, there are some people in this game who actually thought they were good because they combined these two items. What they basically did was throw the entire concept of actually being somewhat mechanically skilled in this game by combining a slow and the cutting potential of no auto attack slow. It makes it practically impossible for a melee character. I seriously don't understand how there is someone out there who developed a following of people who worshipped him because they thought he was a high tier level player, when in reality all they were doing was spamming one of the most scummy things you can do in a one-on-one situation. As a person who has a very high level of respect for people who are very mechanically skilled in this game, I find it very pathetic to see this kind of thing just spammed, Anyways, the only real counter to Frostalis is a Sprint. A Wingblade could help as well, but usually if you don't have a Sprint, you're kind of just fucking screwed. Mobility items. It really depends on the scenario. Fatalis would fit in this category as well, which is why I said long range ability base can do quite well versus it. High burst also gives them less time to juke and kite around when aiming to one-shot. High cooldowns can also help with this in certain scenarios. Crits. Crits are not in the current meta. Buying Nemean makes them horrible. Do not buy crits. Lifesteal and healing. Lifesteal and healing are obviously countered by anti-heal, but in some scenarios, matching lifesteal as an ADC is more important in that matchup, as sustain wins long fights. The only time it's usually appropriate to build anti-lifesteal is if you're ability based, as you can afford to get that beat stick and things like that. Getting a beat stick in an ADC versus ADC matchup is obviously not worth it at all, as pen and power with a bit of anti-lifesteal are nothing compared to, say, you could switch it out for a Kins or an Executioner or something, right? High HP items, Warlocks, Bulwark, things like that. These items are obviously countered by percentage HP cutting items. Much like high protections, percentage is better for bigger numbers. Soul Reaver as well as Kins are your best bet for chunking through their HP. And last but not least are the different forms of penetration. If you're looking for the generic pen numbers and how they work, check out my older guide for a basis on what pen does best versus what. But I think in this section, I'll show the math on what's best versus double defense and why, like, you know, Executioner and Titans are just never worth it, and it's better to go Titans, like I've said. This is the equation for pen. I suggest experimenting around with different numbers like I do every once in a while, just to really see how protections in pen function. I don't really need to go really in depth of why Executioner and Titans is never worth it. Always get Titans versus double defense, like I've already said. Keep in mind, the only reason it's ever okay to buy Obsidian Demonic on a mage is because it's only ever really bought on 2 magical ADCs, right? Who either have Fatalis or built-in one, making them stick to people at ease and not having to waste space in their kit with another item because they can seriously afford it. A factor I'd like to point out before I show the numbers is that if you look at almost every single god in the game, their base magical protections don't go up past 48. Mages only ever stay at 30 as well, so in cases where your opponent does not buy protections, it's always better to go Spear in these cases, as you'll be practically hitting true damage with upwards to 50 pen compared to the 33% of 50, right? So pause the video and take a quick look at the numbers. So as we can see here, Spear and Demonic after every proc is technically the better option at that point, reducing it to 75 protections instead of the 80. But Obsidian and Demonic are a ton better because, as you can see, their protections after the first proc are 111 compared to 141. 5 protections difference after 3 hits is clearly not worth it. So that's it for all the generic type of things that you can do to counter build specific types of items. But just another quick tip, I just mentioned earlier that mages only have 30 magical protections, and others only go up to a max of about 48 magical protections. So if you have a lead, a very good option is to only buy second tier into your magical defense item. This will almost double your protections, automatically forcing them to go penetration either way. So instead of wasting the gold to finish it when you're already ahead and they have no pen, just keep the second tier of that item and you'll still have a ton of protections and can get started early on that next item that you need. The reason why this isn't as useful for physical defense is because your base protections are already quite high to begin with, and once you get mid-game and where you usually end up buying your defense, unlike magical defense that only goes up to 48, physical defense usually scales a lot higher. A third category is thinking ahead. What this basically means is what could they potentially buy, what you think they're going to buy next, and what you should build beforehand. The order in which people build can easily throw leads in even games. For example, like I said earlier on, rushing Witchblade or Nemean can be crucial for certain scenarios. I'll give a few examples on improperly thinking ahead. Your entire match, you should always be thinking, what are they going to build this match, and when? When in the game your opponent buys items can seriously affect the pace of the game. From personal experience, let's use this as an example. One game, I was Erling Shen against an ADC with a 2-kill lead. I was absolutely dominating him, right? I thought since I was so ahead and I had all this pressure, like a bunch of level leads, I could go ahead and build whatever I felt like and get away with it. So I decided to go Kin's third item instead of going defense. In my head, that seemed correct. A bunch of attack speed, a bit of power, as they were still behind. I didn't think it really mattered. The next item my opponent decided to buy was a hide. And them buying this item quickly made me lose my lead and eventually the game. The reason for this is because Kin's is so expensive that the moment I had enough to afford it, he was practically done as defense item. Defense makes my Kin's kind of useless, so I don't chunk through as much HP, and his protections made it so until I had defense to match his as well, as execution for more pen, he actually had the advantage as he could go pen right after his defense. And he was doing a lot more damage than me even with the level differences, right? So no matter how far ahead you are, always remember to think ahead of your opponent and what he could buy next, and just build appropriately. The fourth and final category is actual counter building. So now we actually get into the aspect of seriously counter building. I've gone over the types of damage and how they're generally countered. I've gone over certain items and what items or things are generic or more or less simple type of things that counter those specific item types, right? I've explained the importance of why you need to be secure with your build and always be thinking one step ahead. Now, I'm going to get serious and explain completely why I built certain things and other people built certain things in specific matches and in what order and why and stuff like that, right? Now, it's not always possible to build completely perfectly depending on the scenario. Even the best players in the world have troubles with it at some times, right? But for the most part, I'm going to go over when and what to build from a ton of different matches based on my experience, knowledge and numbers and opinions of other very high-level players. Unfortunately, Smite is currently down, so I can't go through my history and just quickly go through this, but I thought just as good would be to go through Smite Guru and go over past builds of mine and other top-level players and explain in depth to why I built what, or why this person built what in what order and stuff like that. Now, the generic ADC build right now versus a physical would be, it would be Death's Toll, Itchable, right? sometimes bluestone depending on the ADC if it's more ability based for clear, right? Like I go bluestone on Kali, tier 1 Ichival. So you'd go, like, not including the Vulcan here, I'd go Death's Toll, Ichival, Boots, Dev Gaunts, my defense item, Executioner, Kins, and swap out my Ichival for Fatalis. And then I would sell my Warrior Tabby for attack speed boots, right? But in different matchups like this, for example, against a Vulcan, I like to go Death's Toll, first tier boots with a bunch of pots, right? I got Aegis for, his ultimate, and then I rush a Dev Gaunt so I get some power and sustain. Immediately after that, I'm going to get defense because, as you can see, he's doing the exact same thing that I am. I got percentage pen, and I decided to get a Fatalis as Kins wasn't the biggest factor in that scenario. Like in this specific scenario, he didn't build HP base, right? So it's not the most important thing in the world to get, but I would finish with a Kins because of how much damage it would be doing, right? It's still worth it to get it even though he has Thoth. So last item, I would get a Kins. Next matchup, let's look at this one. This is I was Erlang Shen and I was versus a Scotty. It was Donnie. It was a very actually intense game, and I got some pretty cool plays. Anyway, so as Erlang Shen, I started with Death's Toll and tier 1 Ichival, because attack speed, the double proc off of the dog with tier 1 Ichival, it's really nice. And he went Death's Toll and tier 1 boots. Now, I intensely won the early game, and the reason being is that the second after we both finished boots, he started stacking right here, right? He's forced to, like that was a smart decision on his part, like he has to do that, which kind of screws him as a warrior because I can rush early game protections, right? Like I said, like Bologna, I am one step ahead right now. So as he's finishing his protections, I'm finishing, my percentage-based pen, and with a lead, I get that quicker than he can even finish it, right? So then, I go straight into a Kins. Sticking to him is not the problem at the moment. And then I finished it off with a stone cutting, so that mobility wasn't an issue. Now, unfortunately, I ended up losing this game, which makes sense. ADCs tend to win a lot of things late game, and I actually threw it. I went to end when there was 30 seconds, and I don't know why I tried to end by myself without my minions. I was just stupid. I threw it anyway. The main reason why he won and outplayed me was he built the Frostbound Hammer. Now, why Frostbound Hammer was so good in this scenario rather than building a Fatalis and trying to stick away from me is because my mobility was so high, right? Sticking to him with no movement penalty like a Fatalis wasn't a problem. I was faster than he would be if he had Fatalis. He did the intelligent thing and he went Frostbound Hammer, since he uses a bunch of abilities as Scotty, right? He could continuously use them, put his ice under himself, and use his dog, properly, right? So it was a very intense match, but that's why he built all that directly in that order. We both built, correctly, right? Next up is Osiris versus Anubis, which is Donnie right here, who builds very well. So I thought I'd use him as an example. So we started out with Death's Toll into Boots, into Pestilence, which is an absolutely awesome build, and it screwed me over a lot of the times. He's beaten, he did it when I was Freya versus Bologna, which is a good thing to do because I started with the Pythag start. That usually screws over Pythag start, right? Is because if you go Pestilence second item, especially on characters that have generically higher base stats, like a warrior for example, like Osiris or Bologna, they could get Pestilence, which forces them to get pen. They need it. They really need it because it's defense, and it's a lot of protections. It's 90, what is it, 80? It's 80 protections. So this Anubis wanted full cooldown. It makes sense. His build, it's solid, it makes sense, but unfortunately, Donnie just pressured it and made it, played super properly. So after he finished the Pestilence, he went straight into Frostbound, which makes sense because at this point he was starting, depending on the lead, he was maybe starting his breastplate, so he could slow him down and just continue to kill him, which is probably why he went 8-0. And he just stuck to him, right? Because Anubis doesn't really have any escapes, so he would just stick to him. And at this point, and along with, the mitigations and whatever and whatnot that Osiris has, the Fatalis effect he's given. And then he went straight into Executioner because, Anubis was building in the defense next, so he was, one step ahead the entire time. And by the time he actually finished this Obsidian Shard, you can tell he was a little too far ahead, and it just built around an anti-lifesteal, just perfectly built here, right? Same with the actives. Now we have Fenrir versus Freya, where, you know, Freya obviously wins this being a top tier god and Fenrir not being all that great. But Donnie actually ended up winning it even late game, which is even more impressive. I don't know how the guy does it. But anyway, he started out with his boots, right? And he went straight into a runic shield, which not only gives him power but protections, and it reduces the damage that, like, you know, Freya's outputting. And unfortunately, he doesn't have an incredible amount of power or pen just yet. So early game, he has like what 100-ish power with the build he's given. So he's reducing, you know, by 50 or whatnot per auto with the runic shield. Runic shield is actually a pretty good solid start, as well as, you know, the whole pestilence thing versus a Freya. As you can see, he went both in the double defense sort of thing, and Freya built accordingly as well. Look at this. She went demonic grip as well as that obsidian, and she also went fatalis. But unfortunately, Donnie must have pressured her out really hard because he also had a soul eater, which probably caught her off guard, and double lifesteal. And unfortunately, she could not afford to change her build. Actually, I think that she could have switched out the Pythigs for a divine, and she probably would have won this a lot easier. I'm guessing Fenrir just stuck to her really hard with a double defense and continued the lifesteal with the passive on his 2 and stuff like that. All around, the order in which Donnie built was, you know, practically perfect, did everything right. But unfortunately, the Freya apparently could not, you know, do what she could. And I'm guessing Donnie snowballed with the Sunder, and then the weakening made it even easier to, you know, lock him down. Next matchup we have here is Bologna versus Honor, in a matchup where I'm pretty sure it favors Honor quite heavily, because I've played this quite a bit. And Donnie started out with boots, straight into Icheville. Defense makes complete sense. He didn't go Witchblade, he went Dev Gaunts, giving him more power. By the fact that he has Kins right here basically means that he had rushed in Icheville, and he sold a late game. So Donnie won this late game. Now, he went Fatalis, which makes sense, as well as Witchblade, because for those of you who do not know, you cannot mix Frostbound and, or it's just not smart to mix Frostbound as well as Witchblade, simply because the auras, as you can see, it reduces their attack speed by X amount, and it only takes the passive of 1, right? Because this one only reduces the attack speed by, I think it's 15, so they don't stack. It's only the 20% reduc of Witchblade here. So he went double protections, which Diesel has told me about is a very good build. And in general, it's the fact that he had Executioner and he had practically, you know, double defense. It was difficult to, you know, chunk him down, especially with the, you know, the absorption and stuff like that. He went sprint and shell and got up in his face, I'm guessing, and absolutely just demolished him. Here we have another game with the my typical Uller build in the current meta. Now, I start off with tier 2 trans, right? I begin to stack, and he went Deathstoll straight up into boots. And after that, he went straight into Icheville. So his boxing potential up to this point, he does more than me. Which, you know, he's wrong. He has a steroid, he has a slow. It makes sense to buy, right? But unfortunately for him, when you go trans, and you get it like midway stacked, like even if we're completely even, and he has boots and Kins, or Icheville finished, I will have like half of my trans stacked, as well as boots, right? So up to that point, if I hit a stun combo like I usually do, then it is going to chunk him down extremely hard, like very, very, very hard. So as long as it's not all about just auto attack damage and stuff like that. It also factors in, you know, like this is an ability based build that I'm building right here compared to the normal generic auto attack based build. Now I built Soul Eater because in most ADC matchups, I'm not going to double stack, right? And Azzy just is not that worth it. Like, yes, I'll get an extra bit of pen for that early game there, which will make it easier to, like, you know, one shot. But the usefulness of Soul Eater is so much better. Like, you automatically get that attack speed, automatic lifesteal, and you get, like, you know, a miniature med off the bat whenever is needed. And the fact that I go protections immediately after, by the time he's like just finishing this, we're gonna be building protections around the same time. I probably might have gotten mine before his because I was a little bit ahead, but then I immediately go into Titans. Like, even though he has Executioner, I probably finished Titans first. So I was technically a little bit ahead, and I would pressure that lead. I finished it off with the Jotuns so that I had full cooldown and I could just, you know, spam abilities and not really be all that worried. Fully stacked Soul Eater, just all around, this is my my generic build and stuff like that. Started out with the med, he started out with the beats, it makes sense. Yada yada yada. What's that? Okay, here we have another top level game where we have Bakasura versus Onher. Now, Onher actually wins this matchup pretty heavily once you get to around mid to late game. The Bakasura can pressure the early game really well, but unfortunately this Onher here built quite improperly, and I'll explain why. He went, like I said, this is a bad combo, and he was able to, since he barely had any power, all Diesel really had to do was just go, Fatalis, like third item, and he could just stick to him really easily, right? Even with his pillar, it's only like a point in it or so early game. He could just stick to him, and since I don't even know what he's building here, it looks like maybe a winged blade to reduce all the attack speed, which, in theory it makes sense, but at that point, it's probably not the best item you should be going. I would have much rather gotten an Nemean, because even though you're reducing his attack speed, he still has true damage, and he's just doing so much. So an Nemean reflecting that would be a lot better in that scenario. So he was able to just, get the true damage as well as all that attack speed and just stick to him. And imagine if, look at this. He's got so many protections. If he'd have finished that, Onher was doing absolutely no damage. He went Shell. There was just nothing this Onher could have done. Just the order in which he built wasn't correct. Next up, we have a Kali versus Bastet game. Now, I know this isn't really in favor of the Bastet, but she played quite well mechanically, so I thought I'd go over this build in general anyway. But what I start with is a Bluestone Tier 1 Ichival for the rush of Ichival, making it very easy to box in the penetration early game, and it gives me a bit of clear as Kali. The second I finish that, I go into Power Boots, and normally after this, I would go my defense, right? But normally you should always be going defense, almost always third, or your lifesteal item, depending on if you're an ADC or not. But in this scenario, I was doing very well for myself, and I was doing stuff, and I wasn't dying very often at all, other than when I dived her a few times. So I decided to rush Akins, which was probably not the best decision, but it worked very well because I had Blink and Sprint, which is what I almost always get, because it's it can catch people really off guard when you blink properly and burst them out. And the reason I go Titans on Kali over anything is, think about this. Titans is a lot better on high burst gods. You almost always get them on non-auto attack oriented gods, but the only reason I get it on Kali, an auto attack oriented god, is because Executioner procs after the third attack. You get 36% after the third attack. So on Kali, like I've explained in all of my videos, if you want to learn more about that kind of thing, just watch my videos. I explain it as I go, usually. I get Titans because if I blink in and go to surprise this person, if I have Executioner and I hit them once and I auto-attack cancel in between my abilities, I'm not going to get that 36% extra, pen until I, get the third auto in. So if I was to blink in and then, stun 2, auto-attack cancel into the 2, my 2 is Kali, I wouldn't be practically doing anything to my full potential, because I wouldn't be doing nearly as much damage, because I'd only be getting 12, 24% compared to the immediate 33 of Titans. So that's why I rushed Titans, is because she was going protections, and normally I'd go defense here if I was playing passive, but I was playing ballsy because I was in a winning matchup, right? So I went Titans to match his defense, and then I went defense next, right? And higher protections are better versus ability based, obviously. And then I finished it off with a Stomp Cutting, and he rushed a Transcendence last, which probably wasn't the best choice. But anyways, yeah, that's that matchup. Next up, we have a Neith versus Raijin game. Now, I'm not using the whole Raijin, I got a winning matchup, obviously, as really a good, solid interpretation of what you should be building based on who they are. But the reason being of why I went ability-based Neith in this scenario is because ability-based Neith and ability-based of certain gods, like Kali versus a god with no health, like I said, if a mage, for example, like a Freya, doesn't have HP, or say an ADC that's really has a lot of peel, then going Transcendence for a lot of damage and burst is really good with abilities and stuff like that, right? So if I rush an early game Trends as Neith, before he gets his warlocks really stacked, I can, pressure him out pretty hard and be doing tons of damage, and the second we get late game, I could sell it for something, right? So I like to get Transcendence on Neith a lot, because my one just does a ton of damage, auto attack cancels and stuff like that are really, really nice on her. But unfortunately, I went Soul Eater, which makes sense after Trans. Trans and Soul Eater go very well together. I went into Kins after that because, the Warlock Sash started to become into effect. But unfortunately, after this, he should not have started double stacking, especially when he's behind. never double stack when you're behind. The only time you should ever be double stacking is if you are ahead. So I decided to go defense after my Kins because he was starting to go some pen. I actually only finished the second tier of Bulwark before he had started his pen. I did the second tier and I began finishing my Titan's Bane before him. So the second that he finished this, I finished my Bulwark, and unfortunately game ended before that. So yeah, actives are obvious. Anyway, that's that matchup. Now, I've noticed a lot of the time when you see my recordings, like this was a recording game on her versus Anubis, where I didn't completely build properly, and it's because like people can get ballsy at times and build a certain way. This Anubis actually built better than I did. Fun fact, because I went Ichival into boots, Dev Gauntz, which is the normal start, right? And he went the Pythags cooldown boots there. But I had a lead, so I decided to go Executioner once he started to build his breastplate. So I would do percentage-based damage, and he took advantage of that and began to build a Thoth when we got to that point, which probably wasn't the best decision in all, but it was still, smart to build an item before, my protection came online while he had like that sliver of chance to begin stacking and stuff like that. Maybe give himself hope, right? Which almost actually saved him late game, which is surprisingly. We're both nearly the same level. See, so it actually worked out for him, surprisingly. So I finished it off. I went Kins next, and then I finished it off with a Fatalis. I went Aegis first active because his Wrap only lasts so long early game, and I went Beads second active when his Wrath started to last a little longer. So hopefully by now you get a good general idea of what building is like in one-on-one situations and the damage numbers and stuff like that, right? So this is going to be the final build that I'm going to show you guys, because from this point on I keep looking through my matches and they're all relatively the same builds. Just, you really got to figure out in which order you're going to be buying items depending on when the other person buys items and stuff like that, and your lead and stuff like that. So for example, this emote match I found is a little different, and I'd like to explain my magical base build. Now in magical mirror matches, or magical ability based mirror matches such as Hebo and stuff like that, cooldowns are the most important factor. That is the most important thing late game, right? So I had a plan which won me the game pretty hard late game. Like late game there really wasn't much of a, he got first blood, I think he killed me twice early game, but I still ended up winning because of what he decided to build. Now he rushed. He actually built smarter than me early game, which is why I got first blood. He rushed a Warlocks, which is what I should have done, but for some reason I decided to rush boots because I'm a dum-dum. And I went pen boots, which makes sense. Early game, pen boots. You want to go Warlocks, pen boots in almost every scenario, but rushing HP is a lot better early game in a Hebo mirror match, for example. But in other matchups, I would go Warlocks into a pen boots, but then I would go in a generic build. I would go Warlocks, my defense, Pen, Soul Eater, and Rada Tahuti. For example, this could be a breastplate though. But if you think about it, if you sell your Pen boots late game, right, you could pick up a blue buff. Like if you switch them up for Shoes of the Focus and got the additional 10% cooldown. If you picked up a blue buff with a breastplate, you wouldn't have to actually get a Chronos Pendant. See, what I did in this scenario is I built a Genji's Guard, which is awesome, right? The passive makes it so that every once in a while I get my cooldowns reduced, which is awesome late game, right? So basically all I did was I built that, I got a ton of protections, and it gave me 10% cooldown. I had 10% here and 10% here. And what I'd do is I would make sure I didn't care about red buff. I would pick up blue buff, and late game I would buy the 500 pot. And for those of you who know, the 500 pot actually gives 10% cooldown. So I would be at full cooldown, and I had enough room for another item. So I went Soul Reaver, and I could chunk through all that HP that he had with Bulwark and stuff like that, right? So the engagements, see, he had to buy a, he did what I built around, right? I didn't have to buy a Chronos Pendant. I bought a Soul Reaver instead, right? See, he had a Rod. Our builds were practically similar, but I went Genji's instead, picked up blue buff, 500 pot. We both had full cooldown, but instead of a Chronos Pendant with only a little bit of power, I was chunking through his HP like butter, right? Which works really well in that scenario. Thank you so much for sitting through my 45-minute video on just counter building. Now, I plan on doing a bunch of videos that have to do with pure mechanics, and there's a lot of upcoming content, and this video took a very, very, very long time to make, so I would really appreciate it if you left me a like or subscribed. Anyways, I really hope you guys learned something off of this. I tried my best to give out as much information as I could in the time given. There's a lot of information I had to go over, but I hope I got mostly everything. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. I will see you next time.